Sign the damn papers, Elena. $30,000 is a small price to pay for the roof we've kept over your ungrateful head for the last decade. The roar came from Julian, my uncle by blood and my tormentor by choice. He stood behind a massive mahogany desk in the library of the Hamptons estate, swirling a glass of Cabernet that probably cost more than my first car. His face was a bloated shade of purple, his eyes filled with the kind of entitlement that only comes from living off someone else's ghost. Beside him, my cousin Tiffany didn't even look up from her iPhone. She was busy adjusting a ring light, her face illuminated by the artificial glow of a social media preview. "Come on, Elle," she giggled, her voice dripping with that signature curdled honey sweetness. "My followers are dying to see the family charity case actually contribute to the summer gala. Think of it as back pay for all the organic meals and shelter we've subsidized for you." I felt the familiar, searing heat of rage bubbling in my chest. It wasn't a quick, flickering flame. It was a molten lead that had been cooling for years, hardening into a razor-sharp blade. I wasn't the frightened, sobbing 20-year-old who had arrived here after my parents' funeral anymore. I was 30. I was a licensed landscape architect who had spent the last 5 years designing the very gardens they bragged about to their high society friends. Yet in this room, I was still just a servant with a pedigree. "This money was for my firm's expansion, Julian," I said. My voice was dangerously low, vibrating with a decade of suppressed fury. "I've worked 80-hour weeks to save that capital. My parents left me a trust that should have ensured I never had to ask you for a single cent. Where did it all go?" Julian slammed his wine glass down. The dark red liquid splashed onto the white marble floor, spreading like a fresh wound. "Your parents were dreamers, Elena. They left a mess of debts and artistic visions that I spent years cleaning up. You owe me your life. You owe me this house. Now sign that check before I decide that your little architectural studio in the garden shed is no longer a necessity for this family." I looked at the check. $30,000. It was the exact amount I needed to sign the lease on my new office in Manhattan, my ticket out, my freedom. "You're stealing from me. Again," I stated. It wasn't a question. It was a cold realization. Tiffany finally looked up, her lip curling in a sneer. "Stealing? God, you're so dramatic. We're reallocating. Besides, look at your shoes, Elena. You clearly don't know how to spend money anyway. Just sign it so I can finish my Get Ready With Me video. The caption is already written. Family first." I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. Not from fear, but from the sheer force of the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I signed the check. The ink bled into the paper, a black stain marking another year of my life sacrificed to their vanity. I shoved the paper across the desk. Julian didn't even say thank you. He just snatched the check and snapped his fingers toward the door. "Good girl. Now, go find the head caterer. They're complaining about the outdoor lighting circuits. Since you're so obsessed with architecture, go fix it. And try to look less miserable. We have guests arriving in 2 hours." I walked out of the study, the sound of Tiffany's shallow laughter echoing through the hollow, vaulted ceilings of the mansion. The air in the hallway felt thick, suffocating under the weight of 1,000 lies. They thought they had won. They thought I was a domesticated animal that would always return to its cage for a few scraps of approval. They were wrong. As I stepped onto the terrace, the cold Atlantic wind whipped my hair across my face. I looked out at the sprawling gardens I had built with my own sweat. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, jagged edge of a key. One Julian didn't know I had. It was the key to a safe deposit box my grandmother, Margaret, had told me about in a frantic, whispered conversation only yesterday. "The storm is here, Julian. I whispered into the wind, a predatory smile finally touching my lips. And I'm the one who's going to make sure this house doesn't survive the night. The salt spray from the Atlantic felt like needles against my skin, but it was nothing compared to the cold realization settling in my gut. I bypassed the garden shed Julian called my studio. I wasn't going there to fix a circuit breaker. I was going to find the only person in this mausoleum who still possessed a soul. Margaret, my grandmother, was sitting in her glass-walled sunroom. At 84, she was a skeletal shadow of the woman who once ran a real estate empire. But her eyes, sharp, slate gray and identical to my mother's, were still very much alive. "He took the money, didn't he?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. 30,000, Margaret, I said, sinking into the chair opposite her. My hands were finally shaking. "He told me my parents left nothing but debt. He said I was lucky he didn't throw me out years ago." Margaret let out a sound that was half laugh, half cough. She reached out, her thin, bird-like hand gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "Your Uncle Julian is a man who builds cathedrals out of stolen bricks, Elena. Your father didn't leave debts. He left a legacy. And Julian didn't just steal your future. He's been selling your past, acre by acre." She reached into the folds of her silk shawl and pulled out a worn, leather-bound ledger. "I've been quiet for too long, child. I thought keeping the peace would protect you. But watching that girl Tiffany mock you tonight, it broke something in me." I opened the ledger. My heart skipped a beat. Inside were records of land transfers I never knew existed. "The Shoreline Ridge," Margaret said. 200 acres of prime coastal land in Maine. Your mother and father bought it as a sanctuary for you. It was a trust fund meant to be activated on your 25th birthday. I flipped the page. A deed of sale dated 5 years ago. It bore my signature, or a terrifyingly perfect forgery of it. "He sold it? He sold my parents' land?" "To a commercial developer for $7 million, Margaret confirmed, her eyes filling with a fierce light. "He used the first $3 million to renovate this house and buy Tiffany that emerald pendant she flaunts. The rest? He lost it in a high-stakes hedge fund that went bust last winter. He's been bleeding your personal accounts ever since just to pay the property taxes on this estate." The rage I felt in the study was a candle flame compared to the inferno now roaring in my chest. $7 million. My parents had worked their entire lives to ensure my independence, and Julian had treated it like his personal piggy bank. "There's more," Margaret said. "Julian is desperate, Elena. He's about to put this house up as collateral for a new loan tonight. If he fails again, he'll lose everything, including the small portion of your mother's estate he hasn't touched yet." I stood up, the ledger gripped so tightly my knuckles were white. "Why are you telling me this now, Margaret?" "Because," she said, a ghost of a smile appearing on her withered face, "I have stage 4 cancer, Elena. I have 3 months left. I don't have to worry about keeping the peace anymore. And because Julian forgot one thing, I still hold the power of attorney over the original family trust. He thinks he's the king, but I own the land the castle is built on." She handed me a small brass key. "Go to the safe deposit box at North Fork Bank. Inside are the original, unforged deeds and records of every cent Julian embezzled. He didn't just steal, he committed federal fraud." I looked toward the main house. Tiffany was on the balcony, screaming at a servant. Julian was in his office, feeling invincible with my $30,000 check. "He thinks I'm just a landscape architect," I said, my voice cold as granite. "He thinks my only skill is making things look pretty on the surface." "And what are you going to do?" Margaret asked. "I'm an architect, Margaret. I know how to find the structural weakness in a foundation. And tonight, I'm going to pull the loudest, most expensive brick right out of the bottom of his world. I leaned down and kissed her cheek. Stay in your room tonight, Margaret. It's going to get very loud. The next 6 hours were a calculated descent into the heart of a conspiracy. While Julian and Tiffany were busy playing king and princess for the Hamptons elite, preening themselves for the cameras and sipping vintage Cristal, I was in the bowels of the North Fork Bank. The air in the private vault section was stale, smelling of cold copper and old secrets. I stood under the flickering, sterile fluorescent lights, my fingers tracing the jagged edges of the brass key in my pocket. It felt like a weapon. When the heavy safety deposit drawer finally slid open with a metallic groan, it didn't just contain paper. It held a confession written in the ink of betrayal. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of confirmation. As I began to sift through the original documents, there they were. The authentic deeds to Shoreline Ridge, the coastal sanctuary my father had intended for me. My eyes burned as I saw the signature lines. They were blank. I had never legally signed them. Tucked behind the deeds were bank statements, a paper trail of a systematic, cold-blooded heist. Over the last 3 years, Julian had orchestrated a drainage of my trust fund totaling $8.4 million. Every cent had been diverted into offshore accounts and private investment shells. He hadn't just been managing my inheritance. He had been cannibalizing my soul to keep his failing social reputation on life support. I didn't cry. Tears are for the broken, and I was being forged into something much harder. Instead, I used my phone to scan every single page, the flash of the camera acting like a strobe light on Julian's coffin. I hit send on an encrypted email to 2 people, a high-profile white-collar crime attorney known as the Shark, and a former college friend who now ran the investigative unit for a major national news network. "The fuse is lit," I whispered to the empty vault. By the time I slipped back into the Vance estate through the service entrance, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the Atlantic in shades of bruised purple. "Elena, is that you? You're late. The staff entrance was supposed to be locked." Marcus, the head of catering, startled me near the industrial kitchens. He looked like a man on the verge of a cardiac arrest, his white coat stained with sweat. "The outdoor lighting is still flickering. Your uncle is losing his mind, Elena. He told me if the ambiance isn't ethereal by sunset, he's going to sue my company into bankruptcy. He's a monster." I looked at Marcus. For years, I'd watched Julian treat him like a footstool. "Don't worry about the lights, Marcus. Julian won't be suing anyone tomorrow." I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a low, commanding hum. "I need the override code for the ballroom's main projector system, the one for the legacy presentation." Marcus frowned, his eyes searching mine. He saw the fire there. "The code is 0412, my daughter's birthday." "Why? What are you doing?" "The program for tonight has changed, Marcus," I said, a dark, predatory spark lighting up my eyes. "We're showing something much more educational. Do me a favor. When the screen goes dark, tell your staff to move to the edges of the room. It's about to get messy." By 8 p.m., the estate was glowing with the fake warmth of 1,000 expensive candles. Men in $5,000 tuxedos and women dripping in blood diamonds drifted through the gardens. Gardens I had spent my teenage summers planting. Now, they were just props for Julian's vanity. Tiffany was at the center of the terrace, draped in a bespoke silk gown that cost more than a teacher's annual salary. She was laughing for the paparazzi, her head tilted back to show off a diamond necklace that I knew, with sickening certainty, had been bought with my stolen money. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention. Julian's voice boomed over the high-fidelity speakers, silencing the chatter of the elite. Tonight is about legacy. As we prepare for the auction of the Shoreline project, I want to share a short film about the history of this estate and the glorious future we are building. He signaled to the tech booth with a smug, self-satisfied grin. I stood at the very back of the room, leaning against the cold stone pillar, my heart hammering a war drum against my ribs. My phone buzzed in my palm. Feeds are live. The world is watching, Elle. The text from my producer friend read. Then, a second text from Marcus. Ready when you are. Let it burn, I whispered. The lights dimmed to a dramatic black. The giant 200-inch screen flickered to life, but instead of the sweeping drone shots of the Hamptons coastline Julian expected, a grainy, high-contrast image of a bank statement appeared. Then, a massive, zoomed-in shot of my forged signature next to an authentic one. The difference was laughable. The room went deathly silent, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. "What is this?" Julian hissed, his voice carrying over the open microphone, dripping with sudden panic. "Tech booth, this is the wrong file. Turn it off now." But the screen changed again. It wasn't just documents anymore. It was a video, clear, crisp, and damning. It was footage from a hidden security camera in Julian's private study, one he'd forgotten I'd installed when I was helping him with the office remodel. On the screen, Julian was clinking glasses with Tiffany, both of them laughing. "I can't believe the little martyr actually signed the waiver today." Julian's recorded voice echoed through the ballroom, horrifyingly loud and arrogant. "By the time Elena realizes the main acreage is gone and the trust is dry, we'll be halfway to the Caymans. She's too weak to fight, Tiff. She's just like her father, all heart, no brain." The collective gasp from the crowd was a physical wave of cold air. Tiffany's champagne flute hit the marble floor, the crystal shattering like a gunshot. I didn't stay in the shadows anymore. I stepped forward, the crowd parting for me like the Red Sea. I walked until I was at the foot of the stairs, looking up at the man who had stolen my life. "The Shoreline project is dead, Julian," I said, my voice projected with a calm, terrifying clarity that didn't need a microphone. "And so is the myth of your family name. The house of lies was falling, the flames of the truth were rising, and for the first time in 10 years, the air in my lungs didn't feel like ash. I could finally breathe." The silence following the click of the handcuffs was more deafening than Julian's shouting. As the police led him through a gauntlet of the Hamptons elite, the very people he had spent millions trying to impress pulled away as if his touch were contagious. Julian's face, once the picture of arrogant authority, was now a pathetic mask of sweaty desperation. "This is a mistake!" he shrieked, his voice cracking as he was shoved toward the foyer. "Elena, tell them! Tell them it's a family dispute! You're destroying everything!" I stood at the base of the grand staircase, my arms crossed. "I'm not destroying anything, Julian. I'm just letting the truth do its job. You built a life out of gasoline and matches. Don't be surprised when it finally catches fire." But the night wasn't over. While Julian was being processed at the precinct, I turned my attention to Tiffany. She was huddled near the shattered remains of her champagne glass, her designer gown stained with red wine. She was frantically typing on her phone, trying to delete the videos she'd posted earlier. But it was too late. The Family First post had already been shared by thousands, accompanied by the footage of her laughing about stealing my inheritance. "You think you're so smart?" Tiffany spat, her eyes red from crying. "You ruined my life. My sponsors are dropping me. My fiancé just canceled the wedding. You're a monster, Elena." "I'm a monster?" I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. You spent a decade mocking my grief while you literally wore my mother's jewelry. You didn't just take the money, Tiffany. You took pleasure in the cruelty. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. I didn't know, she wailed, though we both knew it was a lie. The bank statements say otherwise, I replied, stepping closer. And so does the recording Marcus just leaked to every major news outlet. By tomorrow morning, you won't be an influencer. You'll be a cautionary tale. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of legal firestorms. My attorney, Mr. Sterling, worked with surgical efficiency. Because Julian had used my forged signature on federal documents, the case moved to a federal prosecutor. The $7.2 million he had embezzled was frozen, and a court order was issued to seize the Hamptons estate for restitution. By the second day, the mansion felt different. The silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. I spent the afternoon in the sunroom with Margaret. She looked paler, but a serene smile played on her lips. The lawyers called, I told her, holding her hand. The developers in Maine are terrified of fraud charges. They're settling. I'm getting the land back, Margaret. The sanctuary Mom and Dad wanted for me. But as the sun set, a final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Mr. Sterling arrived with a thick gray envelope. Elena, there's something else, he said gravely. During the audit of Julian's private vault, we found a life insurance policy taken out on your parents 6 months before the accident. My heart stopped. They had insurance. I knew that. No, Sterling said, sliding a document across the table. This is a second policy, one your parents never signed. Julian took it out on them, naming himself as the sole beneficiary for an accidental death. The payout was $5 million. The room seemed to tilt. The rage I thought I had exhausted came roaring back, colder and deadlier. The car accident, I whispered. The brakes failed on a clear day. We're reopening the investigation, Sterling said. Julian didn't just steal your money, Elena. He might have stolen your family. I looked out at the dark Atlantic waves. I wasn't just going to take his house. I was going to make sure he never saw the sun again. The federal courtroom in Manhattan was cold, smelling of floor wax and old wood. It was a stark contrast to the salty breeze of the Hamptons. Across the aisle, Julian sat slumped in a cheap suit provided by the state, his empire having been liquidated in weeks. Tiffany sat behind him, her designer clothes replaced by a generic blazer, her face devoid of the filters and fillers she once lived by. She didn't look like a queen anymore. She looked like a ghost haunting her own ruined life. As I stood at the witness stand, the prosecutor asked the final question. Ms. Vance, how do you wish to proceed regarding the restitution of the remaining estate? I looked directly at Julian. For years, I had feared his voice, his judgment, his power. But now, looking at him through the lens of truth, I only saw a small, hollow man. I want justice, not just vengeance, I said, my voice steady and clear, echoing through the chamber. The forensic reports proved the brake lines on my parents' vehicle were tampered with. The $5 million insurance payout has been traced back to Julian's secret offshore accounts. I don't just want my money back. I want the maximum sentence for the lives he stole. The verdict was swift. Julian was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for double homicide and federal fraud. As the guards led him away, he tried to scream one last insult at me, but the courtroom doors swung shut, cutting his voice off mid-sentence. He was finally a part of the past. Tiffany didn't escape the fallout. While not charged with the murders, her involvement in the fraud and money laundering earned her 5 years in a minimum security facility. The influencer who lived for likes was headed to a place where she would be just a number. 2 months later, I stood on the shoreline ridge in Maine. The air was crisp, smelling of pine needles and the wild churning sea. This was the 200 acres my parents had intended for me. The land Julian had tried to pave over with greed. It's beautiful, isn't it? I turned to see Margaret. She was in a wheelchair now, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, but her eyes were bright. We had used a portion of the recovered millions to fly her here. It's home, I replied, kneeling beside her. What will you build here, Elena? She asked, her hand resting on my shoulder. I looked out at the horizon. I'm not going to build a mansion or a monument to myself. I'm building the Eleanor Margaret Sanctuary, a residential design studio and a retreat for students who have talent but no pedigree. Kids like I was, who need a place where their dreams can't be stolen by people who think money is a substitute for a soul. I had sold the Hamptons estate. I didn't want the memories of those hollow hallways. I had sold Julian's vanity projects, his yachts, and Tiffany's jewelry. Every cent was redirected into a scholarship fund for rural architects and a foundation for victims of elder abuse. True revenge wasn't the destruction of Julian Vance. It was the fact that I was using his greed to fund a future he would never understand. I was taking the very bricks he used to crush me and using them to build a bridge for others. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the rugged Maine coastline, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I had carried since I was 20 years old. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. It was no longer a fire that burned me. It was the fuel that drove me. I pulled a small photograph from my pocket. My parents standing on this very cliff, laughing, their eyes full of hope for the daughter they wouldn't get to see grow up. I'm back, I whispered to the wind, and the foundation is finally solid. The land finally sounded like peace, not fear. I was no longer the orphan in the garden shed. I was the architect of my own life. And for the first time, the blueprint was perfect. Don't let anyone, even family, devalue you. The best revenge isn't an argument. It's living a successful, happy life. Stay strong and keep moving forward. Justice will handle the rest. Thanks for watching. If this story inspired you, please like and comment below. Don't forget to follow for more. See you in the next one.